We're back live in studio with Samuel Zurzer in the business headquarters of Radio Shalom 1650 AM in Montreal, Canada, with the Money and Business Show. Samuel Zurzer is a consultant with TE Mirador, which has been providing individuals, families, businesses, and employees with truly objective financial advice and education since 1972. You can visit them at www.temirador.com. You have questions about your personal finances? You need advice in making sound financial decisions? Samuel and his guests are ready to take your call at 514-738-4100 extension 200. And now, back to the Money and Business Show.
Here I am. My name is Samuel Zurzer from Money and Business Show, Radio Shalom, CJRS 1650 AM in Montreal. We have live from Toronto's Catherine Jankowska. She is the Vice President, Financial Divorce Specialist for TE Wealth in Toronto. Catherine has more than 20 years financial services and wealth management experience and is accredited financial divorce specialist. And we also have participating in our discussion is Joanne Elizabeth O'Hanlon from O'Hanlon, Sanders and Teixeira Law Firm. Today our topic, a hot one, will be surviving financially after a divorce. This is like an inside look with divorce professionals and the role of the financial divorce specialist and how it can affect your standard of living if you got the wrong advice. So, Catherine, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good, good. So, if you are contemplating divorce, best get your finances in order, right? And what should you know before contacting a lawyer?
Well, most people panic when they first divorce, and their knee-jerk reaction is to hire a lawyer. But if you've never been through the divorce experience, then talking to friends and searching the internet become the places for advice on where to turn. And unfortunately, hiring your best friend's lawyer, if you heard, is good because they're a real fighter, may not be your best option. In a time of overwhelming emotion, it's also sometimes hard to make a rational decision. So racked with hurt, guilt, growth can sometimes cloud judgment and enforce actions that you'll regret later. I think it's important to understand your choices so that you own your process rather than meeting a lawyer who, for example, is litigious and finding out you're paying a lot of money for even more grief that you could have potentially avoided. So maybe something important is you have to continue to co-parent, for example, in your post-divorce life. You know, some clients prefer the per se method, sometimes referred to as the kitchen table method. And I encourage clients to do this if their conversations are open and honest and they can work together in an agreeable manner. And if they can figure out how to divide things up and they find it agreeable, that's great. However, I always ask them to get independent legal advice, or what we professionals in the business called ILA. Remember that those emotions that cloud one's thinking, well, you can literally give up the house because you feel that you are responsible for your spouse's hurt feelings and will turn to regret once you start to work on your own. So the ILA, or independent legal advice, ensures that you're covered from a legal perspective and that you're not cheating yourself on what you rightly do. It also, ensures that you're both signing a contract that you understand and that a professional has helped you to think about other alternatives. I've had clients divorce use this approach, and it works in some circumstances. And hiring that fighting lawyer might be a good choice for someone who needs to be represented by a third person because there's maybe an imbalance in the relationship or a huge sense of mistrust. A litigious lawyer will, underturn every possible scenario and fight typically with vigor for many hours to represent their client's rights. And sometimes in those cases where there's an imbalance, for example, that might be a good route to choose. Although I'm not sure that other alternatives would not work for couples who fit in this category. Mediation is also a consideration. Mediation is when a couple will sit with a mediator and place all the issues to be resolved on the table, which are typically custody, access, and financial issues. And they'll try to get the couple to give and take a little bit and to settle their separation agreement. The clients come to their own resolve, and mediators can be lawyers, but if they cannot give legal advice during the mediation. So it's important to understand that. There are many good mediators who are not lawyers, and my advice for clients who choose this method is always to seek independent legal advice once the issues appear to be settled. And sometimes it's even good to have a lawyer involved in the mediation process. Arbitration is similar in that the couples discuss their issues with a professional, but the arbitrator will decide how to settle the issues. So my opinion is that it's it's dangerous as the clients do not take ownership in the decision making. And there's also a combination, and we call it MEDARB, which is mediation and arbitration, where the couple attempt to settle their differences, and what they can't settle is arbitrated for them, and it's a binding solution. Now, collaborative divorce, which is sort of the final process, is a fairly new in the roster of the divorce processes available. Collaborative lawyers are trained to approach divorce differently than their litigious predecessors. In a collaborative divorce, each person hires a collaborative lawyer, and all four, the clients and the two lawyers, will meet. They call that typically the first meeting is a four-way meeting to discuss the issues and what sort of things can be resolved and agreed upon, and which kind of things are set at an impasse. So what's important to note is all the participants must sign a collaboration agreement stating that they'll be respectful, honest, and forthright. It sounds kind of civilized, right? Like, I think this is a great alternative if you're co-parenting after the divorce, because litigation tends to be more of a shame-blame procedure in my experience, and collaboration does not promote the hostility which is carried over in your life after the ink on the separation agreement is dry.
Yeah.
Right? So what's more is that the collaborative process embraces the interdisciplinary, and that's kind of where I come into the picture oftentimes. Collaborative trained professionals other than your family law lawyer may be involved in the process depending on what the client's needs are. So family professionals can help develop an access plan, commonly referred to as a parenting plan. Financial professionals can help to forecast the financial future with a portion of the assets that are split. Like, can you still afford to retire? Can you afford to keep the house? So I think it's important to understand that you have choices in your process. In hiring your best friend's lawyer, you might get sort of sucked into a process that really isn't suitable for you or your family. So you may want to try to interview a few lawyers before you make your decision as to which process might be better.
Go ahead, Joanne.
Okay, thanks. I love the idea of the interdisciplinary approach. I think it's a great approach. But do you think that it wouldn't be a good idea for parties to start off knowing what the law is before they deviate from it? Therefore, that maybe a lawyer should be the first stop?
Oh, absolutely. And oftentimes people do come to me thinking that they can negate legal fees, and, they think that I can help them divide their net family property. But I can't, because I don't really know how to instruct them in what is, what they're legally entitled to from the law. So, I'm a part of a team, but that's not really my role or my function. So yes, seeking legal advice is probably a good place to start.
I think it's also more complicated in Quebec in that we have public order provisions which do not exist in the rest of Canada. And whether we use the collaborative law approach or not, these certain items are going to have to be according to law. Whereas the balance, we can do whatever we want, we can be as creative as we want, and we can really think outside the box. But the parties have to be aware of what areas we have no discretion, and that the rules or the laws will have to be followed. For instance, in Quebec, with child support.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it is important, as you just said, to start off knowing the law before we deviate from the law, and then take it from there. And also, then you don't have to worry about parties not knowing what rights they had before they signed off on them.
Right. Well, exactly. But I guess in my explanation of all these processes is just to be aware that, that there are different ways that you can come to resolve the negotiations. But definitely legal advice is always something that, I tell my clients to seek.
Catherine? Catherine?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. What are the major mistakes to avoid during a divorce? The most people go through when getting divorced? I mean, sometimes they get into debt or they buy a house before they just go through a divorce process. What are the major mistakes to avoid?
Well, I typically tell my clients, don't make any significant investments, before your negotiation, your settlement is signed. Remember that if it's, still in the negotiation stage, so anything can still happen. Don't make any significant purchases while negotiating your settlement. The old story of the wife takes a visa and goes out on a shopping spree and spends lots of money, to try and get back at her husband or whatever the case may be.
That's right.
But that wife might solely, end up being solely responsible for those purchases. So, that's something just to be cognitive of. And don't make purchases based on any of the projections. Like, while we're in the negotiation stage, you never know how things will turn out. So, in other words, until you have that signed separation agreement, don't assume the outcome.
So, just in brief, what is the role of a financial divorce specialist, in brief?
Well, as we've already discussed, I cannot give legal advice, so that's sometimes an assumption that I have to deal with up front. I can help to stop financial mistakes from happening. For example, I just had a client that I was working with. She had the option of dividing her defined benefit pension or paying monthly payments to her ex. And so I did the forecasting to see which one would be more financially advantageous for her. And it ended up that paying the monthly payments was a better option for her. So without having, me in the picture, she wouldn't really know which one to pick. So it helps to make sort of financial mistakes from happening, and it gives clarity in the answers. I tend to do a lot of budget planning for my divorcing clients. More to your point, Samuel, that two people can live less expensive than one. So if you're divorcing and assuming that you're going to live the same lifestyle, you probably need to do some number crunching to see what kind of lifestyle you can actually afford if you only have one income. So what I do is, where a lawyer will look at what is rightfully yours under a family law perspective, I'm actually taking that answer, if you will, and I'm forecasting the person's financial life going forward. So, for example, if you're trying to buy your spouse out of their half of the equity in the home and you're giving up retirement assets to do so, can you still afford to retire, and how does that change your retirement picture? So there's also an additional way my involvement tends to help the negotiations, because as the spouses and I discuss their options, they begin to visualize their lives apart. So it can almost be sort of therapeutic, if you will. And also, most divorce negotiations stall at some point because one spouse isn't ready to move forward. So understanding the financial piece and working with a professional can add clarity and help to move the process along to settlement.
Oh, I'm looking at over here, forecasting the person's financial life. That's very important for the surviving financially after a divorce. Isn't that right?
Well, I think it also allows clients to sign that separation agreement, with confidence, because now you have half of your net family property. I'm assuming half, if that's the scenario. But what does it mean to you, and how can you still ensure that all your other financial goals, such as retirement or a children's education, be met?
Right. So just stay on the line, Catherine. We have to pay our bills here. We're going to be right back in 2 minutes. My name is Samuel Zerza for the Money and Business Show, Radio Shalom, CJRS 1650 AM in Montreal. We'll be back.